All right. So, all right, handing out notes, awesome. Thanks, Jordan. Well, thanks, guys. Hand those out. Okay, so we're going to talk about today. I don't want to overuse the word apocalyptic or apocalypticism, but I want you guys to become familiar with it if you're not. It's not the best word in the world, but there's kind of, because of academia being what it is, there's not a better word to describe what it describes, and so it is what it is. So apocalypticism, we talked about last session. It was kind of what emerged during that Second Temple period, that conviction that the present age, that the present political situation, that the current candidates for leadership, like none of these things were suitable to actually express and accomplish the things that God had said through the prophets. Right? They just weren't, it just wasn't going to work. God was going to have to bring a day of the Lord with angels and fire, right, John? And that's the only way it was going to work. It's the only way it's going to work. Apocalypticism. Those are the convictions that emerged during that time. And so point one there, just a review of the apocalyptic convictions that were confirmed. Again, so Mary, Zechariah, Simeon, Anna, all the stories from that infancy narrative, these are the ideas that are being cemented in their mind. They're not being introduced. They're being cemented. They're being put in cement. Right? They know the ideas. They're familiar ideas. Now they know for certain. 2 Peter 1, now we have the words of the prophets made more sure because of the Messiah. And he's specifically talking about, you guys remember the story he's talking about, what Christians call the Mount of Transfiguration. It was a vision of the resurrection. That's what was going on. God shows them a vision of the resurrection with the Messiah, with Moses and Eliyahu next to them, Elijah. And he says, hey guys, endure, keep going with me. Because this is in all three synoptics. That's the story that follows the pronouncement, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, okay, very good. If you want to follow me, you're going to have to deny yourselves, take up your cross. This is what it's going to cost. Take up your cross. Didn't mean leave the last piece of pie for your wife, did it? Take up your cross only meant one thing. What did it mean? I remember in youth group, somebody actually telling me that Jesus was the most unique death that anybody had ever died. It wasn't. It was a commoner's death. In Jesus' lifetime, Jesus was in Galilee. I don't know if he was there, but in Jesus' lifetime, 200 Jews were crucified in Jerusalem on the same day, in the same manner that he was. Everybody knew what it meant to take up your cross. It was that dreaded walk from this side of town to that side of town where you awaited capital punishment. So he just finishes, take up your cross, deny yourself, follow me. And in all three synoptics, the very next episode is the Mount of Transfiguration. The Mount of Transfiguration is where God does what John talked about earlier. He said, I'm going to prove to you that it's real. And Jesus takes the three and he gives them a vision of the world to come, the Messiah in all of his glory, and Moses and Elijah there with him. And they go, oh my gosh, it's going to be worth it. Take up our cross and follow him. Let's do it. Peter kind of misapplied it a little bit initially, but he got it eventually. So this is kind of what the life, the death, the birth, the resurrection, the teaching of Jesus, this is what it was about. It was about confirming to that generation that these things are true to such a degree that they would actually take up their cross and make those things known. On one level, the only reason why we're here is because he convinced them that those things were true. He told all of his disciples that there was a cost to following him. He told all of them, if you want to be my disciple, you're going to have to deny yourself, take up your cross, embrace martyrdom, and come after me. And yet, did any of them experience martyrdom sitting in Jerusalem? No, they all experienced martyrdom the same way. The complications of taking what he said out to the Gentiles. What an honor. God's love, the Messiah's concern for the nations, that's the guy you want ruling the nations, that guy. When he tells his disciples, you're going to go before kings and rulers, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. Who are the kings and rulers? Why did any of them stand between kings and rulers? Were they looking for counselors? We read it as though what happened to all the apostles was they were like Josephs who were just giving wonderful counsel to the kings and rulers. Why did they stand before kings and rulers? They were on trial, deciding if they were either going to be executed or just put in prison indefinitely. And Jesus said, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves to go before kings and rulers as a witness to them before the day of the Lord. What kind of a Jewish king loves pagan kings so much that he's willing to sow his own beloved disciples as seed in the ground to be killed so that they would have a witness before the day of wrath? That's the guy we want ruling the planet. Goodness. All of these things get confirmed in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. That's what those events were about, is they were sold on these ideas. They were convinced they were true. They gave their lives to make these things known to their own people and to the Gentiles as a result. And it's the same measure. Like, we're going to go out of here and we're either going to believe the words of Jesus a lot more and our life will look a lot more like that commitment, or it won't. Same thing. We can come in here and get tickled and encouraged and think we have a cute new insight as well. Same measure. Following God's heart always drives in the same manner. And we're going to end up going where we talk about the role of martyrology or martyrdom in creating what we call apocalyptic eschatology. It was central. Even before the time of Jesus, the call of martyrdom was actually the seedbed for developing apocalyptic hope. So, we want to start here. We want to talk about the God of Israel and his people. Because again, we want to understand what God's message for the world is. What is it that is relevant to our lives? How should we live in light of those things? But we can't treat the people of Israel like a speed bump that we just get over as quickly as we can so we can get on with the good part. Me. Right? Let's pause. Let's find out what on earth these things are about. Give ourselves to them and then go out with some authority. Go out with some conviction. So, Karl Barth, I actually heard this in a lecture from Michael Visegrad. He was quoting this section in Karl Barth. And Karl Barth told this story. He said, Frederick the Great once asked his personal physician, Zimmermann of Brugg in Aargau, Zimmermann, can you name me a single proof of the existence of God? And Zimmermann replied, Your Majesty, the Jews. And by that, if one wanted to ask for a proof, by that he meant that if one wanted to ask for a proof of God, for something visible and tangible that one could contest, which is unfolded before the eyes of all men, then we should have to turn to the Jews. This next section, B, in point 1, there's this, it's a small quote from that book I recommended earlier, The Body of Faith, Michael Visegrad, The Body of Faith. He says, Israel is the carnal anchor that God has sunk into the soil of creation. Israel is the carnal anchor that God has sunk into the soil of creation. Meaning, that God has tethered himself to creation. God's not giving up on creation, right? God didn't go, oh no, humanity fell. I guess I gotta just burn this place up and take them to heaven one day. How do we know that's not true? The Jews, sir, the Jews. They are the carnal anchor by which God remains tethered to this world. And we know that God still yet has concern for the families of the pagan nations, and that he has concern for the world itself because of the endurance of the Jewish people. There is no mathematical way to account for the ongoing existence of the Jewish people as a distinct people group. There is literally no way. You could take any generation and look at all the civilizations on the world and look at the ones that are most likely to survive and most likely to be eliminated throughout history. And Jews are always at the bottom. They're always down here. There's always not a reason. It's so unlikely in any generation, much less endlessly. In every generation, they beat the odds and somehow they're here. We look out the universities right now and we see the cries for jihad, for the intifada, from the rivers to the sea, should tell us two things. Number one, God exists. And we know this because Israel is still here. And thirdly, one of the things we're going to develop today, God is still in covenant with that people. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the implications of that. Israel is the carnal anchor that God has sunk into the soil of creation. God has tethered himself. He's not given up on the planet. He's not given up on the Gentiles. He's not given up on the world. And we know because of the existence of the Jewish people, the ongoing existence of the Jewish people here in our midst. So the driver of history, we're just going to do a little survey of the covenants. And then we're going to talk about the development of how the covenants actually were the seedbed for apocalyptic thought. It wasn't just kind of random apocalypticism, but we also want to frame this covenantal view. This covenantal conviction is very, very firmly the only place you can thoroughly locate the early Jesus movement. The early Jesus movement, it's the only way you can understand it. You can't thoroughly understand what's going on unless there's this covenantal apocalyptic conviction that is driving the whole thing. That's where we're going to end. So it really is the driver of history. God's covenant with Abraham and his offspring is how we know that God still cares about the world. And if this is not something that comes into your mind regularly, you are constantly going to have a hard time understanding what is going on in the world. This literally, see what we have on the calendar, the well-known Lech Lecha. If any of you do the Torah cycle, Lech Lecha is the calling of Abraham. Genesis 12. This is God's tether. He tied himself by means of an oath, a covenant to Abraham that he's not going to abandon the world. Who remembers in Sunday school what happened in Genesis 11? Tower of Babel. Yeah, Tower of Babel, right? Tower of Babel is the big strike three for the families of the earth. We had Genesis 3, strike one. Genesis 6, Strike 2, messing with the gods. Let's not do that. And now the Tower of Babel, Strike 3. God said, you're out. I'm not dealing directly with the families of the earth anymore because I would just eliminate them all. Instead, I'm going to take one family. And my relationship with that family is how you know that I've not given up on y'all. So he chooses Abraham. So let's look. Lech Lecha starts like this. That's the rabbinic term for Genesis 12, that Torah cycle, that parashat in the Torah cycle. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so you will be a blessing. Later on in Genesis 17, he would use the phrase, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. In your offspring. It's your children that are actually going to bless all the families of the earth. Now we can't disconnect this chapter 12 of Genesis from chapter 11 in Genesis. What just happened is all the families of the earth just had strike 3, and God committed himself to the well-being of the families of the earth to reconcile them to himself in the family of Abraham. So this is where it all ends with us. Like it is us. It is about us. God's commitment to Abraham is his commitment to the nations. Like as soon as God cancels that covenant, we are on shaky ground with the Almighty. We have no idea. If replacement theology is true, then all of us should be freaked out. That's the only guarantee that he's given that he's still committed to the families of the earth, is that he's committed to the covenant with Abraham. You know, I realize, so passages like this that I just read in chapter 12, you continue on, and these kind of, I don't want to be insulting about it, but it's a casual reading. It's kind of where we get certain ideas of Christian Zionism. That basically Christian Zionism in a nutshell, I'm certainly not an anti-Zionist, obviously, but Christian Zionism in a nutshell usually takes into account the idea that God has somehow chosen Israel, which means they're kind of special, and 2, he's entitled them to the land. Those are the ideas that kind of get driven home and that we fight in politics about. And I get it, but this is talking about way more than that. Way more than that. So I hope to elaborate on that a little bit. So if you go to chapter 15, this is another well-known passage in the Christian world because that's where we take one of the 2 main passages about faith in the apostolic writings, right? The 2 big ones on faith from the Tanakh are, and he counted it as righteousness, he credited it as righteousness. Counted is the actual translation. And number 2, the just shall live by faith, Habakkuk 2. We're going to end with that one. So this is well known. So I had to, again, 2 pages, had to limit it a little bit. But what we have here is Abraham had just finished this battle with the pagan kings. He brought back Lot and his family and all of this. And in chapter 14, and then it's beginning in Genesis chapter 15. I call this section, I'm going to introduce what I'm going to call the burden of being chosen. Because being chosen isn't actually about being special. It's about a task. Right? It's not just that they get to be special people. It's about a task. And that has not yet, like I quoted Tevye the dairyman earlier, it's not a walk in the park to be chosen. Nobody goes, man, I sure wish I could have the walk in the park that the Jews have always had, since they're special. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He said, do not fear. I am a shield to you. I am a shield, or I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. You can translate that a couple different ways. And Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? So real quick, notice what happened? What's a shield do? It protects, defends, guards. And so the Lord says to him, I am a shield to you. And he responds, but I don't have any kids. Isn't that a weird response? So he understands the word of the Lord as a covenantal statement. Abraham, I've got you. I'll take care of everything I said. I'm going to take care of it. He just had a funny interaction with, anyways, you got to read it at the end of chapter 14. But he said, I'll take care of it. He said, I am your shield. He goes, but I don't have any kids. And then later on he goes, and I'm going to give the land to your family. I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. And he said, Lord, how may I know that I'm going to possess it? Same question. I'm your shield. I'll take care of your offspring. I'll take care of giving you the land. I'm going to take care of the covenant. I'm going to take care of it. I'm your shield. And he goes, how do I know? And if you read the narrative, he doesn't actually explain how he's going to do it until later. And it's disturbing. And it kind of launches the burden of election into the history of the Jewish people. And in verse 13, so this is known as it's the covenant of the pieces. Do you know what I'm talking about? That whole section where after they have this interaction, he goes, how do I know you're going to give me lots of kids? And how do I know I'm going to inherit the land? He goes, bring me some animals. We're going to divide them in half. And then deep sleep comes over Abram, and he begins to walk through the pieces. And he says, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Why is that the beginning of the assurance that God will take care of it? What does that have to do with anything? Because he asks him a question and God says, okay, let me explain it. He cuts the pieces, and that's his initial response. The point is that God is serious about choosing that family, and he's serious about that family actually being able to disciple the nations back into relationship with the Almighty. He's so serious. This is how serious. 400 years in slavery. Was this because of Torah disobedience? This is Genesis 15. There's no Torah disobedience. This is not because they were disobedient to whatever Torah covenant. He said, I've got you. I'm going to make sure all that I've said to you takes place. I'm your shield. And he said, you're going to go and you're going to be slaves there for 400 years, but I'm going to deliver you the mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Not a coincidence. You know what he says a number of times in the Torah? He explains the commands that he's giving them, specifically about how they ought to relate to Gentiles in their midst. And then he said, he goes, you remember when you were in Egypt and you were slaves? That's how you know how to deal with them. Deal with them the way you were not dealt with. You know how to not deal with people when you're the minority. You deal with them this way. Deal with them the way they should have acted. Part of the covenant dynamic is that God has constantly put that people into situations where they must learn how to disciple the nations into his way. Sometimes often it's extremely painful. But from the very beginning, before we even have Torah disobedience, it's not a penalty. It's not a penalty for breaking the Torah. He just says, I'm a shield to you. I've got the covenant, so I have to send you into exile. I have to send you. All of these things are taking place in the land of Israel. And he said, I have to send you guys. You have to go into exile for a while, and you have to be slaves, and then I'll bring you back. Mighty hand and outstretched arm. And so then we have, of course, what happens in Sinai, where he goes, the beginning of the Sinai story in Exodus, begins with Exodus 2:24, looking and explaining what happens before God intervenes with the sending of Moses. It says, and God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac and Jacob. So the covenant with Sinai always should be understood as an extension of God's covenant with Abraham, number one. And it's more teeth on that anchor into the soil of the world by which we know God has not given up on the world. As long as God is still committed to maturing and sanctifying the descendants of Abraham, there's hope for the world. If God forsakes them, if God no longer has any concern for their holiness, we're all in trouble. One of the reasons we're all here, honestly, John and I have talked about this a number of times. We love to just think that we're super insightful people that came up with all these really cool ideas, and the Holy Spirit was, a lot of it really is a historical development. We're not having this conversation unless 1948 happens and the Holocaust precedes it. Nobody was rethinking these ideas until that happened. So if you have a father who loves his child, loves him, and you see him interacting with his child, and like, wow, look at him. Look at how he smiles when he holds him. He loves that kid. What's the opposite of that? It's not anger. It's not being mean. It's apathy. Sometimes dads are broken and they're mean because they love their kid and they have no idea how to express it in a healthy way. So they're just full of angst and anxiety and all these things, and so they express it in a way it's not right. But the apathetic dad, that's the opposite of love. And that's what Israel does not have. They do not have an apathetic dad. They have a dad who's so committed to the covenant. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. I remember reading, it was Michael Visegrad. Michael Visegrad in the Body of Faith has a section where he talks about the Hebrew. Again, he's a Jewish theologian, and he talks about the way the Bible seems to talk about, like both in the lifetime of Abraham and later on, how God relates to Abraham. And he goes, it sounds like God fell in love with Abraham. It's like if you've ever fallen in love and somebody goes, what do you love about him? You know, there's a lot of things I love about him, but I don't even know that those all, if you add them all up, that can't contribute to exactly why I fell in love. I fell in love. This is exactly how God communicates his love for Abraham. It doesn't make sense. It's not because they're the most qualified of people. It's not because they're the most numerous people. You guys could definitely be the most effective at reaching all the nations of the earth. And of course, Jewish tradition has 3 or 4 ways that it explains why Abraham was chosen, or suggests why Abraham was chosen. But the only thing we have in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, sounds like God fell in love with him. Sounds like God just set his heart on Abraham. He said, you and your family are the ones that I'm going to use to restore the planet. All the families of the earth are going to be blessed with you. And so it's God's enduring love for Abraham that remains the driver for history. Okay, Exodus 19. So this is the kind of the formality that we understand to be the kind of the inauguration of the Sinai covenant. It says, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the sons of Israel. A couple of observations. If you indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, that's where the Sinai covenant introduces a different dynamic. If. Now the if, what God promised Abraham, God's still madly in love with Abraham. God's not saying if because he's reconsidering what he said to Abraham. Sometimes he's reconsidering certain families within Israel, and sometimes he's considering certain generations of Abraham's descendants, but he's going to do everything he said to Abraham, no question. That's not negotiable. But he introduces this if. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the beginning because that is sort of the dance that the prophets have. The dance of the prophets is that there's one leg, one pillar of the covenant. I'll use the leg since I'm rocking between two legs. One leg is God's commitment. It's a universally enduring commitment to do all that he said to Abraham. It transcends generation. It will happen. It is a guarantee. And there's the other one. There's the other leg. That certain generations and different families of his descendants are capable of disqualifying themselves if they choose. So this is sort of the genius of the Hebrew prophets, is that they learn how to do this dance, where they learn, and God's covenant to Israel kind of goes back and forth on leaning between these different legs. Right? Where he'll, the one that is the generation that's hardened and full of injustice, what can they possibly offer the world when all of their leaders are oppressing the poor? What can they possibly? And so he sends the prophets, and they lean heavily on this covenant with Sinai. If. He said, the Lord said he won't allow it to go on. You will be a holy people. And then, of course, you have when they're exiled, and you have Daniel. And Daniel gets to lean heavily on the other one. So a lot of the post-exilics, with everlasting love he will regather. He's never forgotten. He didn't fall out of love with the patriarchs. He still remembers. That's enduring. That's always continuing. Even though there's contemporary issues going on. They're just rocking. This is the wisdom of learning to read the prophets and what's going on in their contemporary setting. Is that learning how to go back and forth between communicating the assurance that God will do all that he said to Abraham, and also calling them to repentance, because it's a dreadful thing to be found lacking if you're in that covenant. The one that he promised to Abraham. Let's look at some of the things from the Sinai era. This is Deuteronomy 28. This is to close out the Torah. I say often when someone asks me, okay, I just want to be able to open the Bible and understand it. I go, well, okay. So if you want to understand the apostles, you got to understand Jesus. Okay, yeah, but if you want to understand Jesus, you have to understand the prophets. And if you want to understand the prophets, you have to understand the Torah. And if you want to understand how the prophets were seeing the Torah, you have to understand Deuteronomy. A little bit of a cycle. But Deuteronomy is the lens that the prophets had. They knew everything, but Deuteronomy became, especially if you understand what's going on in the era that we think of as just generally the prophets. Like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, the era that these guys come from. I mean, if you understand the timing indicators of where they're coming from, I think it's Jeremiah. I think it's Jeremiah that it describes. Historians are split. Some Jewish traditions say it's the same guy, but he's the son of Hilkiah. Hilkiah was the priest who rediscovered the book of the law under Josiah. And so we read the introduction of his ministry, the prophetic ministry under Jeremiah. He sees a vision of the almond branch, and it's the little parable in Hebrew, and he says, "I am hastening my word to complete it." What word? They had just rediscovered the Torah. His entire ministry flows out of, oh my gosh, now we understand what God has said. And the Lord says, I'm hastening my word to do all that I said. And in Ezekiel, the weird little passage, take the scroll, eat the scroll, Ezekiel. What scroll? What is he talking about? Same period. They had just rediscovered the book of the law. Take it, ingest this. It'll be sweet in your mouth, but then it will be bitter because of where it's going to lead. So he takes the book, it's that prophetic symbolism, but the point is the prophets are just learning in their contemporary setting how to process. Oh my gosh, God fell in love with Abraham. There's no escape. Deuteronomy 28. It's a well-known passage for usually a lot of unfortunate reasons because of how it's used. But now it will be, if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments, which I command you today. This is what I mentioned earlier, the prophetic perfect tense. It literally says in Hebrew, then I have set you on high above the nations of the earth. Translated, so that we understand. The Lord your God will set you on high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. It has a handful of different things, and it concludes with the Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, as he swore to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord and walk in his way. That's a lot of ifs. Continues in the same chapter, in the same chapter continues, Deuteronomy 28, down in verse 63. It will come to pass that as the Lord delighted over you to prosper you and to multiply you, so the Lord will delight over you to make you perish and destroy you. You will be torn from the land where you're entering to possess it. Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the earth to the other. And there you will serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known. Among those nations you will have no rest. There will be no resting place for the sole of your foot. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and despair of soul. Because God fell in love with Abraham. And Abraham said, how do I know? How do I know you've got it? How do I know you're going to take care of it? How do I know that this can happen? He said, well, if it starts with 400 years in exile, or 290, 210, something like that, the actual, anyways, it's 400 years from that time on. But if it starts like that, God's serious. God's really serious. So this view, this conviction about God's commitment to the covenant is actually, it becomes the lens by which they begin to process. Remember we talked about last session, we talked about the different factions that had splintered off. We'll call them ideologies because they're not all philosophies, they're not all parties, they're just ideologies. Some of them were Hellenization. Remember, Hellenization meant to kind of cave to pressure to be like the nations. The nations they're fine with the Jews as long as the Jews don't insist on being Jews. They always have been. Right? So the pressure comes, it mounts, especially in the Greco-Roman world, where everything tends to be homogenized. But you also have these others, and they're developing in their reflection, they're developing, what does it mean that God's in covenant with our people? And in all honesty, if you were to look back, if you were in the first century, to hear the things that Jesus said, to see who he was hanging out with, where he was standing on halakhic situations, you wouldn't have trouble identifying Jesus. He fit broadly within the Pharisee movement. If you understand what the Pharisees were saying at the time, he definitely fit pretty well within that world. Those were the main ones who were saying, no, we take serious the covenant. We believe that God is serious about what he said, and we don't believe he's forgotten. And we believe that we need to learn how to live accordingly. Those were the main ones. Jesus fit very well within that group. But what happened over time, it actually began in Ezekiel's time, is you have a shift in the conversation, because things like this in Deuteronomy, like if you're reading them as theology, that's one thing. But if you're a Jew and you're reading them, you read it differently. Because what's the famous adage about having two Jews in a room? You have three opinions, right? So how can everybody go this direction when not everybody has the same opinion? Not everybody's behaving the same way. So how does God have regard for the righteousness of some and not of others? And so that becomes a real serious question in this period of the exile. Why does Jeremiah? Why does Ezekiel? What about Daniel? Daniel's an example of righteousness. Why does Daniel get exiled? Well, that's not just. So a lot of those questions begin to kind of frame the conversation of how we're going to regard God's covenant faithfulness. So, the Deuteronomist, and so that this view of Deuteronomy also kind of had because if you think about Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy didn't actually have a lot of new information in it. If you read the Torah, Deuteronomy's recapitulating most of the information found in Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus. But interestingly, Deuteronomy actually takes those things and it points them differently. It acts like they're all leading somewhere. It acts like they're actually going to have like some sort of radical apocalyptic end. If you read through Deuteronomy, especially from 28 onward, it doesn't sound like, well, there's just going to be this cycle and you're going to be caught in it endlessly, and let's just hope you're born in a good cycle so that we can stay in the land. And that's not how Deuteronomy reads. Like there are sections in the Torah. We're all familiar with the New Covenant with the house of Judah and the house of Israel, right? That covenant. So what's one of these promises associated with that in Jeremiah 31? He will circumcise your heart, give you a new heart. So in the Torah, a number of times, the Lord says to them, listen, don't be like the nations, circumcise your heart. Like, cut off that stuff that causes you to stray, circumcise your heart. But Deuteronomy anticipates at the end, there's a time coming when I gather you from exile. This final time when I'll do the circumcising of the heart. And the prophets see this. There's a time coming when God will circumcise the heart of Israel. So, okay, let's look at the, I'm just going to do a little bit of reading here. We'll go to Tobit. Somebody have the Apocrypha handy? Don't leave home without it. The Apocrypha is great. I just have to pull up my New Revised. Okay, so we're going to talk about the apocalyptic hermeneutic, how apocalypticism gets read back later into the Torah and into the prophets. And they go, oh, we now think we understand what they were talking about. It gets read back. And because you can't have a hermeneutic if you're like in real history in real time as a Jewish person. Hermeneutics aren't like just something you casually do on the side. Like you're trying to figure out what on earth is going on, what God is doing, and how we ought to respond. And so Tobit in 14. So Tobit is a Second Temple text that's posing as an 8th century text. Meaning, it's a Second Temple text that's basically, it's telling the story of a man named Tobit who lived before, or who they're claiming lived before. And Tobit is basically this man who epitomizes a righteous son of Abraham. That's who Tobit is. And on his deathbed, in chapter 14, verse 3, it says, when he was about to die, he called his son Tobias and the 7 sons of Tobias, and he gave this command. My son, take your children and hurry off to Media. For I believe the word of the Lord that Nahum spoke about Nineveh, that all these things which will take place and overtake Assyria and Nineveh. Indeed, everything that was spoken by the prophets of Israel, whom God sent, will occur. None of all their words will fail, but all will come true at their appointed times. So it will be safer in Media than in Assyria and Babylon. For I know and believe that whatever God has said will be fulfilled and it will come true. Not a single word of the prophecies will fail. All of our kindred, the inhabitants of the land of Israel, will be scattered and taken as captives from the good land, and the whole land of Israel will be desolate. Even Samaria and Jerusalem will be desolate. And the temple of God will be burned to the ground, and it will be desolate for a while. So you see, he's a righteous son of Abraham. And what faith looks like during this period is he's literally telling his son where to move. He goes, because it doesn't matter how many generations have passed. God's going to do what he said. Doesn't matter. So it's definitely going to be safer in this pagan city than that pagan city, because this is what the Lord said he's going to do. And we always believe the Lord's going to do what he said. And this kind of conviction, I mean, again, when we're talking about hundreds of years, like, it's just so radical and bizarre to have some weirdo like Tobit telling his son, just keep holding on, it'll happen. Like, it's for sure going to happen. It's like some, some weird prophecy that happened, around the founding of America or something like this. And families that are literally living their whole lives, convinced that it's going to happen at any moment, and making life decisions on the basis of that prophecy, they look like total freaks. Yeah, this is what faith looked like. This is an example. The apocalyptic conviction kept growing, that actually instilled greater certainty even though time kept passing. I think Habakkuk 2, which I mentioned before, leaves a great example of kind of how this developed. You guys maybe read Habakkuk 2. I'm going to read it a little bit differently. So, Habakkuk 1. Habakkuk 1 is the vision of the Babylonian invasion. It's quite brutal. It's not pretty. It's very ugly. Habakkuk notes this, and he goes, wait a minute. You're a just God. They're even worse than us. That's not fair that you're going to let them prosper and triumph over us. Everybody's going to say that their God is greater than our God. No. This is a terrible plan. Let's not do this. He's trying to do the Abraham negotiating thing. And then he just sits. He goes, okay, I'm going to sit and see what he answers. And that's when chapter 2 starts. I will stand on my watchpost and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he'll say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. Excuse me, Almighty, I have some issues with what you showed me. Here's my take. And now he sits. And then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it, or so that the readers may run. So, meaning, write down what you saw in chapter 1. It's a done deal. It's going to happen. Write it down so that the one who reads it has a chance to run away when they see what I've said. For there is a vision, or, sorry, I got to change. I don't like the NRSV there. Verse 3, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal. It will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So even though it goes beyond your lifetime and the lifetime of your audience, I want you to write it down, write the prophetic oracle down so that they at least have a chance to run away when they see it happening. That's where we get to the famous quote. Behold, the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by faith. Problematic Hebrew passage, especially for the reformers. Because in Hebrew, it doesn't say he'll live by faith, it says he'll live by faithfulness or reliability. It doesn't mean he'll live by whatever. It doesn't mean like he'll believe proper doctrines about the divinity and whatever of Jesus. It means he will live by reliability or live by faithfulness. Translating that word different ways. So what is he talking about? But the righteous will live by, normally it's inserted his there. So the way this word works, the way this noun works in Hebrew, is it could either be pointing back to two things because of the way it's tensed. Is it could either be pointing back to the righteous one. It's his righteousness, or his, not righteousness, but his faithfulness that's in view, his reliability, or it could be pointed back here to the vision. The righteous one will live as though the vision is reliable. Here's the difference. There's a proud one, and there's one who looks at the oracle and goes, it's reliable, and I'm going to live my life accordingly. That's the righteous. The righteous man, or the just man, will live as though the oracles were reliable. This becomes the way you frame a righteous person in that Second Temple period. A faithful one is one that looks at the oracles of God and continues to count them as reliable. But at what cost? Sometimes it's just moving to a different city. So it may be my favorite story to just go back and just renew myself in a real, tangible expression of faith is the story of the 7 brothers and their sweet mama in 2 Maccabees. If you've never read this story, I'm actually gonna skim it. I have a few minutes. I'm just gonna skim the whole thing. Okay, have a few minutes. So this is in context. So it's been said, if you know again, Happy Hanukkah. If you know the story, we have kind of 4. They're not all complete, but we have 2 main versions of the Hanukkah story: 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees. We have a 3rd and a 4th, but they're a little bit different, and they're different accounts. And it's been said of the 2 main ones, the hero in 1 Maccabees is the Hasmonean family. The Hasmonean Maccabees is just a word that means Maccabee was a nickname for Judah Maccabees. It meant the hammer or the hammerer. That was his nickname when he would crush the enemies of Israel. He was the hammer. And that sounds like a professional wrestler. But so the Maccabees, but the family was called the Hasmonean family, named after an ancestor, Hashmon. The Hasmonean family. So if you ever hear the Hasmonean dynasty or the Hasmonean era, that's because the family that took power after the Maccabean revolution was the family of Hashmon, or the Hasmonean. So the first, it's like I said, 1 Maccabees. 1 Maccabees, it's often said that the hero of the story is the Hasmonean family. They come, all is lost, but the valor of these men, of Matthias and his sons, who go out to the wilderness and start this revolt, and God empowers them. He does the miracle in the temple, of course, we know from Hanukkah. They're the hero. Second version, 2 Maccabees, tells a little different story. David De Silva says, it's like the same story, but it's a different hero. Here, the hero's God. Here, it's very different. Here, there's no human hero. There are human people who star in the story, but overwhelmingly, the hero in the second one is God. And I think this right here, chapter 6 and chapter 7, are incredible stories of what we're talking about, this apocalyptic faith. Because the apocalyptic faith is really, it's essentially a conviction about God's enduring loyalty to his covenant with Abraham and his covenant with Sinai that withstands unimaginable circumstances. And the individuals involved, they become heroes of the faith. Many of them are the ones that are talked about in Hebrews 11. So chapter 6, without going into all of it, there's Eleazar the priest. Eleazar the priest, this is a period of forced Hellenization. You know, there was a lot of coercion. Yeah, it'd be good. Let's put a gymnasium at the foot of the Temple Mount. Let's give them lots of good reasons. Let's entice them to become Greek-ish. They even found ways to, anyways, we don't get into that. But lots of methods to basically we can become Greek-ish. And so this is basically what's going on until things are not working. Women are still secretly circumcising their children on the 8th day. They find out about that. They find out about other things that are going on. They finally said, we're done. We heard a rumor that you guys are planning a revolt anyways. We're just going to force Hellenize all of you. And so now it's like capital punishment if you circumcise a baby. Now it's like you could have capital punishment or be imprisoned if you won't eat pork and offer incense to foreign deities in the presence of a soldier. And so that's where Eleazar the priest comes in. He's a respected, devout man. And a young soldier comes up who had already Hellenized. And he's there to oversee in the presence of everyone the great Eleazar. What's he going to do? Is he going to cave? Or is he going to stand fast to the covenant? And he comes up and he says, Eleazar, it's me. I went to your yeshiva. He said, my parents used to take me. But I left, and look, I brought you some kosher meat. And I'm going to tell everybody it's pork. You can eat it publicly, save your own life, and you can still keep going on with your good work. Nobody will know the difference. And Eleazar stands up and says, God forbid I do this thing. God forbid. He goes, do you know what I'll be teaching the young people? That we should prefer life in compromise than faithfulness to God in death? He goes, no, I gladly choose death. And he did. And he was martyred. This became the framework for martyrdom long before people happened to be killed just because they believe in Jesus. That wasn't a martyr. Martyrs had say-so in the outcome of their life. So following this, you have the incredible story of 7 brothers and their devout mama. And I have 7 kids, and they have a devout mama. And it is, to me, it's one of the most powerful stories in Jewish history. And so what happens is, it happened also that 7 brothers and their mother were arrested and were being compelled by the king under torture with whips and thongs to partake of unlawful swine's flesh. And one of them, acting as the spokesperson, said, what do you intend to ask and learn from us? For we are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors. So the king gets angry, and he heats up this cauldron of boiling oil. And he says, I'm going to start boiling you alive one at a time. And mama's going to watch. And the first one, and he commanded that the tongue of their spokesman be cut out, and they scalp him. They cut off his hands and feet while the rest of the brothers and the mother looked on. When he was utterly helpless, the king ordered them to take him to the fire, still breathing, and to fry him in the pan. The smoke from the pan spread widely. But the brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die nobly, saying, the Lord God is watching over us, and in truth has compassion on us. As Moses declared in his song, this is Deuteronomy 32, that bore witness against the people to their faces when he said, and he will have compassion on his servants. And after the first brother had died in this way, he brought forth the second. They tore the skin off his head, and they asked him, will you eat, rather than have your body punished limb by limb? He said, no. And they began to torture him as they did the first brother. And when it was at last his last breath, he said, you accursed wretch, you dismiss us from the present life. Whew. I can never make it through these sections. But the King of the universe will raise us up to everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws. And then the third. And as he was dismembering them, it says, and he stretched forth his hands, and he said to the soldier, I got these from heaven, and because of his laws I disdain them, and from him I will get them back again. And then the fourth. And when he was near death, he said, one cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals, and to cherish the hope that God gives of being raised again by him. But for you there will be no resurrection to life. And the fifth, and he looked at the king, and he said, because you have authority among mortals, though you are also mortal, you do what you please. But do not think that God has forsaken our people. Keep on and see how his mighty power will torture you and your descendants. Then the sixth, and when he was about to die, he said, do not deceive yourself in vain, for we are suffering these things on our own account. because of our sins against our own God. Therefore, astounding things have happened, but do not think that you will go unpunished for having tried to fight against God. And the mama the whole time was encouraging them. And then Antiochus felt that he was being treated with contempt. He's the king. And so he went to the mama to try to talk some sense into her. I've killed 6 of your children. You have 1 son left, you old, poor widow. What are you going to do? Go talk some sense into that boy. There's no way I'll make it through this. And she went, and in their native language, she said, my son, have pity on me. I carried you 9 months in my womb and cursed you for 3 years. I've reared you and brought you up to this point in your life, and I've taken care of you. I beg you, my child, look at the heavens and the earth and see everything that's in them, and recognize that God did not make these things out of things that existed. And in the same way the human race came into being, do not fear this butcher. Prove yourself worthy of your brothers, accept death, so that in God's mercy I may get you all back again. This is the kind of faith that was in development leading up until the time of Jesus. Son, don't you dare break up the family. That's how concrete this apocalyptic faith had become, that the widow mama tells her last son, accept death, please. Don't separate the family. I know God will give you all back again. When Jesus comes on the scene and says, if you want to follow me, guys, this is where it's going. You're going to have to deny yourself and take up your cross. It's because everything about discipleship pushes the issues to the limit to see if there's actual trust in the oracles of God. And in response, the righteous will live as though they are true and reliable. This is how the apocalyptic hermeneutic developed. It wasn't a theology about the manner in which things are going to happen. Because what those things mean is that this age is fundamentally wicked and broken, and it's not going to be fixed in a comprehensive way. We're very engaged in our community in making disciples. But we tell people often, yeah, God loves you. Being close to God is so much better than being far from God. But it's way easier to not be a disciple of Jesus. Everybody gets slapped. Not everybody has to turn the other cheek. Right? Everybody's going to get slapped. Being a disciple doesn't just make all your life circumstances great. But this is where several of these stories that I just read, these are actually referenced in Hebrews 11. These are part of this group of faithful men that become in chapter 12, the great cloud of witnesses. It's a confusing passage too. What does a witness do? Yeah. Witness doesn't look. Acts chapter 1, when he said, you will receive power when the Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my observers to the ends of the earth. Doesn't make any sense. No, the great cloud of witness is telling us what faith looks like. It's to anticipate, to die, not receiving what was promised, so that you can receive a rich inheritance in the world to come. It's part of the deal. It's not extra, it's not shocking, it's not surprising. This is fundamental discipleship. Even if it's been lost. And these are the stories that it comes from. These stories are not simply, I think things will be better for humans in the next age, so I'm going to accept it. It's, I know God's covenant with Abraham is enduring. That's the anchor for everything. There is no if you don't have the covenant, all this is just Gandhi. This is just Gandhi. Just nonviolence. That's all it is. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a conviction that God will do everything that he said to Abraham. Everything. All of those things will come to pass. You cannot understand how these convictions developed over that period unless we understand that it had already been driven home. Wow. The implication that God's going to do everything just as he said, it's a cross to bear. No pun intended. It's a cross to bear. To be chosen was a cross to bear. Look at Romans 3. It says, what is the benefit of being a Jew? It's great in every way, for they are the stewards of the oracles of God. It's a costly stewardship, guys. We have the Hebrew Bible and we have even the apostolic writings because Jewish people like this gave their lives in martyrdom so that we could continue to have the oracles of God and that the world could look back and go, oh my goodness, is this really what God said he's going to do? One of the things I hope you realize from this is that you look at realized eschatology and you can strip away all the fancy talk. Replacement theology, realized eschatology, meaning you just look at the plain things that the prophets said and you spiritualize them to make it look like they already happened, to take away the tension, bring it into your own life and make you feel better about yourself. It's faithlessness with fancy language. That's all it is. It's absolute disregard for the words of God. And I've just lost hope. I just want to say that they happened. It's faithlessness. It's simple. It's just fancy language. They can't afford it. They can't afford it. And so all who regard the oracles as sacred, all of them who regard them as reliable, we bind ourselves to the same fate. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Like Peter said, what are we going? I guess you have the words of eternal life. I mean, what are we going to do? We're stuck. So, as a history lesson, I want to say that it's not that these things just developed as like, oh, that's a cool hermeneutic for reading the Bible. I want it to bear down on you the cost of what it looked like in history for some of these people to have faith in the oracles of God. And realize that even if we're not sons of Isaac and Jacob, that these things often, for disciples, they have a weight associated with walking them out. Following Jesus just has this way of pressing things. You know, even if you look at it cosmically, it's like the curse, Genesis 3 and the curse, the Bible calls it a curse, not a fall. When the curse happened, three fundamental things, right? Relational conflict, death and sickness, decay of the body, and trouble providing for yourself. That's basically the conditions that God subjected the world to. Romans 8 said the one who subjected us to those conditions somehow thought they were redemptive. Somehow thought he did all of that in hopes that all of creation would be redeemed from its bondage to decay. They have a redemptive role to play. Something about death, the threat of death, presses the issue of faith in me that otherwise I don't have an opportunity to encounter. The threat of not having enough and being forced to rely on God and yet looking at my brother in need and going, oh my goodness. Like we listened to 1 John, how can you say if you have this world's goods and you don't give it to your brother? The only way you can say that it's not a wise choice is if you don't believe God repays. If you don't believe that the one that gives to the poor is just lending to God, like the proverb says. All of these mechanisms are working constantly, and Jesus helps illustrate this life of faith so beautifully in his teachings. That's literally what we do when we disciple people. We just lead people through the teachings of Jesus. And they have this way of just discipling. Jew, Gentile, doesn't matter. Just kind of putting all the faithless elements to the surface. And you go, oh my gosh. But if I just do that, then that's unreasonable to expect. I know. The only way that's a good idea is if God's going to raise the dead one day, isn't it? Go figure. So, to wrap it up, I want to say what we're talking about, this apocalyptic view, this idea that all of the things that God said, despite what looked like, oh, maybe it's happening, and again, like I said earlier, the results were underwhelming. The enduring faith that resulted from that time. No, God is going to do all that he said. And eventually, the temple, this is not the temple. Well, I still think God's going to build a temple. Oh no, he's not David's heir. Okay, I thought he was, but that's not. Oh my gosh, maybe now we're going to just usher in everlasting righteousness with the Mecca. Oh, we didn't do that with Hasmoneans. They're kind of scoundrels, half of them. Oh, I guess not. So then what? You know what? I think all of those things are going to happen one day. Remember the prophets, they used to talk about that all the nations, they have all of these days to try their ideas. They just get to keep going and, maybe this will work, maybe that'll work. But God has one day. And after that day, everlasting righteousness. Men will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. No more will the world learn war anymore. There'll be peace from sea to sea because there'll be everlasting prosperity in the world again. Man, I think all these things, I think God's going to do them all in a day that he's appointed, where his arm will descend from heaven in a flaming fire. That's all that we're talking about. That's how they did it. But those things didn't happen outside of this conversation of the covenant. God is functioning on the basis entirely. Yes, he absolutely loves the families of the earth. He loves the nations 100%. And because he does, he has tethered himself like a dear Jewish brother, like Visegrad said, where's that at? Into this people that became the carnal anchor in the soil of the world. So we look at Israel, and God's dealing with Israel. Right now, we can look at what's going on. Despite the injustice, despite the craziness that's happening in the world, and how quickly wickedness came to the surface. And we go, oh my gosh, God's in love with Abraham still. Oh my gosh. Just like we want that one Jew who was glad to send his disciples as a witness to pagan kings and let them get killed or imprisoned, just so that pagan kings would have a witness before the day of the Lord. That guy, in the same way, he's preparing a people that are going to be able to steward all these pagans. Isaiah 2 happening, flowing up to Zion. Not great people yet. People that probably have bad relationship historically with the Jewish people. But it's this conviction that God's going to do all that he said. It sounds wonderful until you think about the implications. We began with Abraham, God saying to Abraham, I'm your shield. And he says, how do I know? He says, here's how you know. I'm so committed, I'm going to make you guys slaves for a while. Man, it's a burden. Election is a heavy burden. So like we said before, like I was talking about the two legs of the oracles, two legs of the covenant, where you constantly find the prophets looking at Abraham going, oh, God never forgets the patriarchs. He's going to do all that he said to Abraham. He's the shield of Abraham. This is how the Shmoneh Esrei, the Amidah begins, is blessed are you, shield of Abraham, knowing that God remembers the covenant. And then always this pivot to, oh, God's going to make us holy. God's going to actually make us walk in the way that he said. We're actually going to be the people stewarding the nations on Mount Zion in Isaiah 2. And the stories we read, 2 Maccabees 7, 2 Maccabees 6, Habakkuk 2, Tobit, all of these things, these are simply historically how God has stewarded the oracles through the nation and with their people. So it's important to know how he's done it with them. But as John was talking about, you can't really understand where apocalypticism is leading unless you deal with this issue of martyrdom and death. Unless you deal with this deal of God raising the dead and it being forced on you to actually decide if you believe that that's true. Because there are so many reasons to not do that. All right, I'm going to pray.